Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Brazil from 1985. A very influential film and iconic film, certainly among fans of science fiction, among fans, those with an interest in dystopian stories, and certainly people who appreciate social satire. And we look forward to discussing it tonight with the person who not only suggested we watch and discuss it, but gave us a wide-ranging and really, really thoughtful introduction to it, Paul Wright. Paul, how are you tonight?
Good, good. And you?
I'm fine. I hope you are better than your background would suggest, at the very least.
Remains to be seen. You may have to retreat into fantasy.
For those of you who might be new to joining us, the way things work is we ask you to please keep your audio on mute until I call on you. I will know to call on you because you will hopefully please use the raise hand function within Zoom, and then I will see your name pop up and I will call on you to make your comment or ask your question. We'll try to get through everybody once. We can usually do that, and if we have time, go back for seconds or thirds. In addition, please use the chat function. We often have very wide-ranging conversations among you all in there. And if you are from outside the greater Philadelphia area, please let us know in the chat, say hi, and let us know where you're from and how you found us. And if you're from really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, please visit the Where in the World section of Film Studies Online. Via brynmarfilm.org, and let us know more about how you found us and what you think of how we're doing if you've checked out multiple programs. And with that, I guess we are ready to get started. Let's see. Our usuals have gotten us started off very quickly and promisingly. We greatly appreciate it. And so we will hear from Janis and David to start us off.
Good evening. There are too many things to potentially discuss for an hour and a half. So I'll try to limit a little bit. This was a film that Janis described partway through as absolute genius. At the same time, I was trying to figure out some of the more technical sides. When I realized, and unfortunately, I didn't realize until about an hour into the film, that Tom Stoppard was the co-writer, which to me gave me some insight into the script that I hadn't thought about. But I'd like to have Paul and Andrew, if the two of you would discuss what you know about his role. The budget seems to have been low, considering all that was accomplished by Gilliam in the special effects department. And as a throw out to special effects, do either of you know if there was anything that ever crossed his mind in making this film that he decided he couldn't accomplish? It felt like, in addition to this complete story of horror and love at the same time, that everything that crossed his mind went into the film for us. So hopefully that gives you a start and leaves about 100 things for the rest of the group to talk about.
Well, thanks a lot for that, David. I should mention at the top here, and you mentioned it to me in an email over the weekend, that we a lot of you are probably like me, and you couldn't find the 143-minute, the 2-hour and 23-minute version of the film, and that's okay, because you probably found the 133-minute or the 2-hour and 13-minute version of the film, which I know was on Amazon Prime and probably at most other places, because that tended to be, that's the so-called sort of compromise cut that eventually Universal released. It wasn't the 94-minute atrocity that Paul rightfully wanted us to avoid at all costs, which I trust you all did. It wasn't the full longer version that, was sort of, if Gilliam had his druthers, would have been released, but it was much closer to that than it was to the 94-minute, as the runtime would suggest. So I'm sure that most of you probably saw that 133-minute version, and I think for pretty much the purposes of our discussion tonight, we'll all be on the same page. I also want to mention, before I let Paul pick up on Stoppard or Gilliam's visual appetite or whatever, I also want to mention on the Criterion website, there's a wonderful company I'm sure most of you know called Criterion. They have a channel, the Criterion channel. They put out really top-notch, thoroughly remastered and rich with extra content Blu-ray discs. On their website are 2 essays about Brazil, because they did at one point release an edition of the film, and one of them by David Sterrett, I believe, mentions a lot about the filming and the visual effects and how some of those were achieved. And so for those of you like David who were curious about some details, I know that's one place you can find some. With that, Paul, anything on any of the interesting points David raised?
A lot of interesting points. I guess 2 come to mind. First, on the question of special effects and production design and the look and feel of this film based on limited budget. I think from a certain perspective, Gilliam was always fine with being limited in that way, particularly because of the surreal nature of the universe he's creating in this film. If things look strange or not quite real, or even in some way almost toy-like, right? Not at all authentic, right? I think that's by design, because he really feels the world of Brazil, which he thinks in many ways is our world, is a world of artifice, a world where nothing has substance anymore. And so it kind of fits the aesthetic and the themes of the film to have the production design be a little less than or what you expect in a film where authenticity is important and what is expected. On the question of Stoppard, I'd love to hear David's thoughts there, because he seems to have some. I think Stoppard does bring a unique voice here. If you know any of his plays, or something like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which also turned into a very interesting film, you know that the artifice of daily living, let alone the artifice of society, is really important to Stoppard. The lies we tell ourselves to make it through the day, that's very much part of the kind of existentialist strain that Stoppard is part of. And so I think there's plenty of that in Gilliam himself. It's just Stoppard made a very nice partner in that regard. But David, if you had something in mind regarding the Stoppard, I'd love to hear it.
It was really just the type of, I'll call it somewhere between genius and sometimes Stoppard is so intellectual and so intelligent that it's difficult for us mere mortals to follow him. And there were parts of this that I felt were so intricate. Some of them were going by very quickly and trying to grasp them. And once I realized that he had this involvement, I was trying to decide who was the more fastidious about keeping this track. And of course, it's always the editor at the end also. But I felt like, to the extent that I know anything about those 2, it was sort of a battle as to who was going to run the minutia of this, both the daily life and some of these things that were flying by us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, spot on. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And again, Stoppard is a compliment, I think, ultimately to Gilliam in this way. Whether that ends up being your taste, the kind of film that you like or not, I wonder if we have a fair amount of people here who haven't seen the film before. There could be some who didn't care for it or found it baffling or incoherent. I would just say that it's much more coherent when you see it in the longer version. If you try to watch the 94-minute version, not only is it a betrayal of the themes of the movie, but it makes the entire world of that film incomprehensible as far as I'm concerned. And it's already challenging enough for the reasons you're describing.
I mean, part of the interesting thing about this movie is, I find it, entirely capable of being followed. I find it frustrating in ways, but I also know that to an extent, the character, Jonathan Pryce is frustrated. The character's frustrated. The world being depicted is meant to be extremely frustrating, among many, many other things. And so I sort of wonder in cases like this, and there are a few other movies sort of like this, where you're left with the negative, you're left with a sort of what you would typically characterize upon viewing a movie as a negative reaction, but it's depicting something negative. Is that intended, and is that a credit to the movie, or is it an unintended byproduct of an unsatisfactory movie-going experience? And I think that, I think in this case, it really is an intended byproduct. I think that, I think this, this movie is trying to very, very hard to do something that's very, very hard, which is to get us in the mindset of the character. And I think there are moments where it's very effective at doing that. Let's see. Kathleen, you had a question or comment.
Hi, this is Ron with Kathleen.
Oh,
well,
hi,
first
Ron.
of all, I would like to say that we've been participating in these discussions pretty much the whole pandemic. And one thing is that it has stretched our viewing of films. This is one film I had never seen before and probably wouldn't have watched it if it hadn't been recommended. So I'm going to ask, I hate to bring up the abomination of the 94-minute version, but you mentioned in your introduction, Paul, that there's a happy ending in that one. And was that the scene where it was a dream scene in the longer version where Sam and Jill are off in that little mobile home, kind of in the wilderness, kind of off the grid?
Pretty much. So what is a dream that Sam is indulging in to try to escape his torture is treated in the 94-minute version as his reality, as his escape from everything that's going on. And so that's the most outrageous thing about it. Plus it's just harder to follow, and it's truncated, and then you throw commercials in the mix, because the first time I saw that version was indeed on television. And it just shocked me. It was an object lesson in how much editing matters, because the film I saw as a first-year undergrad, which was certainly the 133-minute version, or perhaps the longer, I'm not sure, but it wasn't that cut version, the 94-minute. When I saw that in the theater on campus, I just sat there in stunned silence when it was over, and I wasn't alone in doing that. And the version you see on television betrays all the darkness of this story. I can't see in any way, shape, or form how Gilliam could have allowed his name to be on it. He was kind of forced to for contractual reasons, but said a lot. I don't care that Sid Sheinberg's version exists. That's okay, but let him put his name on it. It's his version of this story, not mine.
Let's see. Gene, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, hi guys. It looks like, Paul, we have the same resonating images coming out of the movie.
We do.
We haven't talked tonight, I know you did in your intro, but about the whole controversy with Sid Sheinberg. Did he have, way after the fact, even decades later, did he have anything to say about the film that was contrary to his decisions that he made, during the release? Or
you mean Sheinberg?
Yeah. What did I say?
Yeah, if you watch the documentary on this called The Battle of Brazil, which Criterion has, and that is kind of the definitive collection of materials on this film. Sheinberg is interviewed in it, although not on camera. It's interesting. It's only a voice recording. And he's very thoughtful, articulate, and pointed in defending his reasons for what the studio did. And of course, a lot of his reasons have to do with economics and making sure there are enough screenings each night, so the film has a chance to make at least a little bit of money, because you already know it's not going to be everybody's taste. So he has some real world concerns that are actually kind of compelling when you hear them articulated in the way he does. He also comes off as someone who's being very much, the letter of the law in saying, you promised us a certain length, you promised us a cut we could work with, you did not deliver on that. We offered to work with you to get to this shorter version, but you didn't want to do that, so we just took it upon ourselves to do it. So I've never heard Sheinberg retreat from that position. It seems like he was pretty dug in, and so was Terry Gilliam, and then the whole thing went very, very public and got nasty.
Right. A quick follow-up. Did this controversy, or the controversy, was this the start of his difficulty with studios, or was he having trouble before that, or was this the one that kind of got him blacklisted in a mild way?
Kind of like Orson Welles, right? Some of Gilliam's problems are visited upon him by hostile studio heads, and many of his problems are visited upon him by himself, right? Yeah. There is a cantankerousness, an edge to him that I think makes him an interesting filmmaker. So I wouldn't want to really take that away from him, but it didn't always let him work and play well with the suits. And I think he did feel burned after this. And then, of course, if you know all his troubles in getting a Quixote movie made, which went beyond, studio problems, it was just acts of God and bad luck and a host of other things, right? It seems like between bad luck and bad attitudes on all sides, he's never made a film too smoothly. Right. And has always made a film his own way and kind of said, if the audience likes it, so be it. I hope they do, but I'm okay if they don't. And this is not what Sid Sheinberg wants to hear, right?
Right. Thank you.
I mean, there's usually in these situations, there's enough blame to go around because the contract says what the contract says, but on the other hand, a studio has the priorities the studio has, and every filmmaker knows that. And a filmmaker as iconoclastic and sort of offbeat as Gilliam, the studio should know. It's like those football teams. It's like, the New England Patriots, like they think they can fix every troubled player that no other NFL team can handle, and sometimes they can, but plenty of times they can't. And studio heads are sort of like that. That being said, Sid Sheinberg is the person who gave Steven Spielberg his start and was his sort of rabbi in the industry, if you will, and Universal's success and growth in the 80s and 90s and 2000s is basically because of Spielberg and that relationship and the loyalty. So he has some reason to think that he has a way with filmmakers, but on the other hand, if you can't see, if you can't look at Jaws and Time Bandits and say that Terry Gilliam and Steven Spielberg are not the same type of filmmaker, then that's some short-sightedness on the studio's part as well. So, that's the sort of thing, everybody probably thought they could, Gilliam probably thought, I'll get their resources and I'll make something and it'll be so interesting, and they hired me, they know what I'm going to do and it'll all be fine. And the studio probably thought, well, we can sort of mold him to our more conventional ways, and they really neither of them should have really thought that.
And to Andrew's point here, it's sort of a situation of being victim of your own success. And by this, I mean, there are at least two things on Terry Gilliam's resume before this movie that would have encouraged someone like Sid Sheinberg and his superiors to roll the dice on Gilliam, right? Even knowing what they ought to know, as Andrew said, about who Gilliam is. One thing is the Monty Python brand, right? Which, as edgy as that humor is, and it is a marketable brand by that point. So I think they felt, well, this is someone out of that Monty Python school. That's going to bring people to theaters. How bad could things go? And the other thing on the resume that Andrew mentioned, and we were actually talking about before we got started tonight, is Time Bandits, which Andrew described as being a kind of difficult film experience for him. He can speak to that. But the one thing you can say about Time Bandits is it's more welcoming to a younger audience, let's put it that way. And so some of the executives thought, we're going to get another Time Bandits out of this. It may not be Monty Python, but hey, it could be Time Bandits, and that did really well, and that had wide appeal. And this movie was not going to be any of those things. It's not Monty Python, even though it has some Monty Python alums in it. It's certainly not Time Bandits either. It's a whole new thing, and it's much edgier and darker. And this was not at all what the studio was hoping for.
Yeah, and I can't remember who brought it up in the chat, but this is sort of a period of kind of high concept comedies involving technology and science fiction, movies like Back to the Future and Ghostbusters. And this isn't that by a long stretch, but you could imagine how a studio or a marketing department would think that they could sell it to an audience as such, even though they really should have known better. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
As usual, lots of them. First of all, thanks for recommending this. I've had this on my in my list of things that I needed to see again. I saw it when it first came out. I don't remember what the format was, probably in a movie theater. And at the time, it was as a fan of Monty Python and Time Bandits. And as you mentioned, it was incomprehensible. I'm sure I saw the 94-minute version then. And having seen it again now, I had an oh my gosh experience and exhilarating experience. An absolutely wondrous film. And I agree with David. There was just, we could talk for hours about this. So I'm going to focus on a comment that I think it was Andrew who made at the beginning about how that this was an influential film. And it certainly was, but it was also influenced. And I was, as I was watching this film, I was just taking notes because it was so rich. Ian Holmes' character Kurtzman, is that a reference to Harvey Kurtzman of Mad Magazine? And all the contraptions in Jonathan Pryce's character's apartment, were those references to Rube Goldberg? And did that influence Nick Parks in his Wallace and Gromit opus? You also, Paul, in your introductory video, talked about this as 1984 and a half, and it certainly had that feel to it. And it reminded me that in 1984, there was a film version of 1984 with John Hurt and Richard Burton that had some of the same feel to this in terms of just the design of the place. There were also lots of other references. There was a character named Harvey Lime. Was that a reference to Harry Lime? Jonathan Pryce's performance reminded me of some of the performances in the early days of Woody Allen. And Paul, you'll pardon me for spying, but I saw on your shelf in your introductory video a copy of Mad Max Fury Road, another dystopian film.
I'm a sucker for dystopias.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask you about. A completely different genre, but nevertheless dystopian. And then this film and the entire opus of Gilliam's work, and the ones that are somewhat similarly dystopian, like 12 Monkeys, or at least depressing, like The Fisher King, and then finally Kafka. Okay, I've said too much, and there's a lot to chew on from me and from everybody else. So get at it.
That was great. No, I loved every bit of it. You hit so many things, and I learned things from what you were noticing.
Hey, one more thing. Battleship Potemkin,
Odessa Steps.
the Odessa Steps.
Yeah.
Once again, there it was.
Again, it always comes back, doesn't it? Yeah. I guess the only thing I would say, I might have said this in the lecture, the intro or whatever. It really is the case, I think, for Gilliam that he's being truthful in interviews when he says, if I hadn't become a filmmaker, some buildings would have blown up and my life would have been very different, because I was so dissatisfied with American society, British society, the world in general. You know, this person is a product of the 60s counterculture. And he saw in himself enough of a capacity for lashing out in open rebellion that he felt like it's either do that and pretty much assure myself of being dead or in jail, or make movies and channel my rage in a different way and use my love of film to channel that rage. And so that's where all these influences come in, right? It's a way of metamorphosing that rage into something that's still angry, but is focused aesthetically and creatively. And I think that's what's recurrent throughout Gilliam's films. It's this lashing out at a world that he didn't ask for, that none of us asked for, right? There's this old Marvel comic, Howard the Duck, right, which became a disastrous film by George Lucas. But the tagline of Howard the Duck, the comic, was always something like, trapped in a world he didn't create. You know, that's Howard the Duck's dilemma. But I read that and I wonder, whose dilemma is that not? It's what we're all facing at every moment. And I think Gilliam simply emphasizes that stability that goes with it in a way that makes for interesting films. Not always perfect films, not always great films, certainly not all as great as Brazil, but films that transmute the anger into some kind of aesthetic form. And I think one way of doing that is drawing on all these influences of the past that you just laid out. I think that's part of the process of tempering his own rage.
You brought up a few things, both Joss did and you did in your response, Paul, that I wanted to mention. One is there have been some comments in the chat, and I would love to hear more sort of thorough explanation of this from anyone who wants to chime in with a comment or question. That this movie is flawed and isn't a masterpiece or Gilliam's masterpiece. I think this movie is long. I'm hard pressed to really think what could be taken out of it. I'm often a critic of movies being too long and movies having redundancies in it because filmmakers are insecure in their ability to effectively communicate. And I think that part of, you know, if this movie seems, you know, as I said in sort of in the beginning, if there are frustrating aspects of this movie, I think that's by design. I mean, maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but I really think that's by design. And frankly, I saw all sorts of encounters and other things that I thought would be, could have been depicted in a far more frustrating way than they were, particularly later in the film, I suspect, because Gilliam realized he'd sort of made his point to a certain extent with certain elements. The other thing about the reference to the look of things and the Rube Goldberg-esque nature of it, I'm always struck in Gilliam's movies, and I find this to be true for most of them, that even the ones that are supposed to show a new technology or are supposed to be set in the future, it's a future that is built upon very, very familiar, often very old technologies applied in new ways. And I think that is both a sort of design choice, a reflection somehow of Gilliam's personality. I mean, this movie is about a totalitarian state that has the means to have unbelievable amounts of knowledge and control over people, but all the video screens are so tiny that they have to use the magnifying blocks that people used in the 40s and 50s when TVs first came out and their screens were so tiny. But there's one of those at every station, and those little screens are connected to all sorts of things. I think that you can almost imagine in Gilliam's mind that if he shows new technology that is thoroughly impressive in something like they do in something like Blade Runner, also to dystopian ends, that's sort of not dystopian enough, right? Because in a way there's some optimism or hope or some sign of advancement that there's this new technology, not that the sort of pieces from the scrap pile have been repurposed and duct taped together to make life, worse instead of better. And I think that it's a lot of times when people watch movies like this, they're I'll speak for myself. One of the things about the dystopian world is that at least is sort of, there's going to be some advancement in a way, even if it's advancement for horrible purposes. Gilliam doesn't even want to give us the depiction of the advancement in a way. And I think that's a very interesting choice. The last thing I'll say is that Joss mentioned Kurtzman, and Gene mentioned in the chat that Gilliam had worked for Kurtzman at one point. So that was clearly, I think, a accurate reference that you picked up there, Joss.
Andrew, just to build on what
Sure.
you're saying, you were so spot on, I think. The picture of the future or the present, however you want to put it in this film, is so disturbing in part. I think I described it in the intro as convenience, talking about update the software on your phone in the last year, or
Paul, could you go back and repeat that, because your internet sort of cut out a bit, and you said after you referenced something you said in the intro. What was it you had said in the intro that you just referenced?
Oh, just that the world of this film is filled with maddeningly inconvenient conveniences, right? All these things that are supposed to make our lives better and more efficient. So in this way, think of the last time you had to update the software on your phone, or any task that's supposed to make your device that changes your life better. And it doesn't, right? It just wastes more of your time and frustrates you. I mean, we're living through this with Zoom, wonderful as it is, right? And I think too, the scary thing about Gilliam's dystopia, to Andrew's point also, is yes, the government has all this authoritarian power and surveillance authority over you. And when they deploy that authority, people die. So it has real consequences. But the really scary thing about the world of this movie is no one's in charge, right? There's no clear sense of an agenda or anyone pulling the strings. There's no man behind the curtain like in The Wizard of Oz. And that would be much easier, wouldn't it? If we could just find the person or people who are doing all of this to us. But in a fundamental way, Gilliam's saying, we're doing this to us. We're enabling an indifferent bureaucracy to dehumanize us.
Yeah, I mean, there's the film certainly plays upon sort of a fascist aesthetic with its deco design elements and the uniforms of the government employees and the sort of, the Speer-like, look of some of the buildings and all that stuff. But on the other hand, as you're saying, Paul, the enemy really is bureaucracy, right? The enemy really is that sort of is institutional, inertia and the nonstop growth of institutions. And that is something that has been a problem to varying degrees everywhere in the political spectrum, right? They borrow the look of familiar, overpowering, fascist, regimes, but the fact that, as Paul just said, you can't point to the ideology that you would in the film that is, you would say, sort of like, whatever, Nazi-esque or, fascist, Mussolini-esque or whatever. But we're all too familiar with, the guy can't fix your air conditioning because he doesn't have the right form, but he's at your house with the tools. I mean, come on. And it's 100 degrees outside. So, in that sense, Gilliam may have his own particular political persuasion, but this movie doesn't really require anyone to buy into one or the other, because it's talking about a sort of institutional state that, should be recognizable, unfortunately, to pretty much everybody. Lee, you have a question or comment?
My question was, the version that I could get through Prime Video was about 132 minutes. I wondered what was left out in that one from the one that's 100 that Paul recommended as the full version, 144 minutes.
So I think you got close enough to Gilliam's vision that I'm not too worried that you saw the 133 versus the 142. But that said, the longer version, Gilliam's preferred version, the one that's on the Criterion collection, was the version shown in Europe. The American version was a bit shorter, right? Not the 94-minute version that ends up on TV, but the 133-minute version is often called the American version. So what's in the European version? A couple of things here and there. For one, a much longer sequence in the dreams of Sam fighting and saving Jill, as the noble warrior. A much longer sequence involving the samurai his armor is made up of microchips, if you noticed. So that whole thing is drawn out and not split up the way it is in other versions. And what I do think is thematically interesting as a difference, I don't think it's decisive, but if you look at the Christmas theme of the film, and I mentioned this in the intro, right, that in a strange way, this is a Christmas movie, perhaps more bizarre even than Die Hard being a Christmas movie. But there's a lot of reference to it, like the Consumers for Christ and the young boy on Santa's lap asking for a credit card for Christmas. There are a couple more Christmas references in the longer version. One is when Mr. Buttle gets taken by the government. There's a line that's in the longer version where the young boy in the family is asking about when's Santa gonna come. And the mother, I think, says something like, the boy asks, can Santa come if we don't have a chimney? And that's right when the government thugs, come through the ceiling and grab Mr. Buttle, who's going to lose his freedom and his life. So there's another reference to Christmas there. And perhaps even more pointed, when Sam is captured at the end, Mr. Helpman, the person who was close with his mother, the person that some people view as possibly being Sam's real father, he goes to see Sam in prison dressed as Santa Claus. So he's still wheeled in his chair, dressed as Santa Claus. Apparently he left a Christmas party where he was handing out toys to young lads. And he's there basically to tell Sam, Jill, your girlfriend is dead. You are part of this conspiracy against the state. There's not much I can do for you. It's really a shame it came to this, too bad. So Santa doesn't give you anything like what you asked for Christmas. In this case, your freedom and your autonomy. Instead, that's all denied to you. So some of those Christmas themes get fleshed out a little bit more in the longer version. But other than a few things like that, I don't think you missed that much. I don't know that I would cut the film much more than the 133-minute version, but it certainly doesn't need to be 142.
Thanks for that, Paul. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yep. Hi, guys. I'm going to go a different route here. First of all, confession. I never saw this movie because I would not have touched Monty Python with a 10-foot pole because I was too snooty to do it and probably missed out on a ton. So this was a first for me. I thought this movie was absolutely, positively hilarious. And as far as I'm concerned, dystopia be damned. I had so much fun watching this movie. It took me from one funny moment to another. From an acting standpoint, I just got such a kick of watching all these A-lister British, brilliant, serious people, from Ian Holm to Jim Broadbent, to all of them, doing the most marvelous comedic things that they could possibly do. The memo that must have gone out to them was just have a great time and be funny. I can tell you that if by some chance somebody had said to me, there's an audition for a movie, would you like to go to it? I would have killed to be in this movie because it looks like it was so much fun. The comedic stuff was, it just completely, to me, it just blinded the theme. So I really didn't care. I didn't think it was particularly dystopian because I was just having too much fun. I mean, I couldn't take seriously from the very first scene with the bug, as you, Paul, mentioned, falling on the typewriter, and the name, the mistaken identity went from, what did it go from, Tuttle to Bottle, from tut to butt. So, okay, so from right there, I was a goner. I was laughing. Any way in the world anybody could take anything serious when you saw that hat shaped like a shoe walking into the restaurant and not just fall all over yourself. I can't even imagine. There were just little wonderful things, even the visors on the brims of the hats, Bob Hoskins' hat is just marvelous comedic things that actors can play with and do stuff with. Ian Holm they all had trench coats, of course, because they all had to be film noir looking, but Ian Holm's trench coat came down to his ankles, and he's a little guy anyway, so he looked absolutely ridiculous. I thought, oh my goodness, so many treats that were given by a director. Having said all this, and I enjoyed it really more than anything, I was upset by the ending. And you mentioned that you Paul, you felt that the ending had to be serious and sad. I thought everything about this movie was building towards an ending that had to be happy. So I was really kind of gobsmacked at the end when, the other wonderful actor, Jonathan Pryce, who's just a treasure, was stuck in that same state as, Winston in 1984. And it didn't work for me because I was having too good a time. So I thank you, because I never would have watched this movie ever. And I just laughed from beginning to end. So what can I say? There's my take on it. And yeah, do talk about the ending, and do talk about the ending, perhaps in light of the comedy of this film. I'd like to hear what you had to say.
So it warms my heart that you found it entertaining and funny, because I do too. As much as I take the film seriously, I was laughing the whole way the first time I saw it, and I was laughing the whole way the last time I saw it very recently. So I'm glad you're stressing that. What I will say, though, is there are moments when not just the humor gets undercut, but the effort of people, especially bureaucrats like Sam, their effort to smooth everything over, get the right papers signed, and just kind of forget this whole Buttle business. There are moments that undercut that, or even undercut the funniness of it all. And the one I mentioned, I think, in the intro is when the wife confronts Sam and says, "What have you done with his body?" There's no more serious moment in any movie than that. And I'll agree, it's not the laugh riot that maybe a lot of the rest of the movie is, but it's a reminder that this is a serious thing. People's lives are being crushed for no reason, and we're all just kind of going on our merry way despite that. So I do think it's a film that dances back and forth, let's put it that way, between the comic and the deadly serious. The ending, there are some who don't view the bleak ending as all that bleak, in the sense that they feel in a society that's so oppressive and demeaning, the best you can do is to retreat into your own mind and your own fantasies. And in that one way, it is a kind of victory for Sam, because no other victory is possible. The state will always crush you. Bureaucracy will always dehumanize you. So maybe Sam is better off than the rest of us. So that's a kind of positive way of looking at the bleak ending, if you will. I don't know that I'm that satisfied looking at it that way, but I've read plenty of compelling defenses of the kingdom of one's own mind. You know, what does Satan say when he falls in Paradise Lost? The mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. And from Satan's point of view, it means I win no matter what God does to me. And I think that's where Sam is at the end of this movie. The mind is its own place. For me, objectively, I just can't find that satisfying. But Sam might be far happier than any of us in his fantasy there at the end. I don't know what you make of it, Andrew. It's an ending that provokes lots of reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the inclination to say a film that has such comedic and relatively light highs and such truly, you know, sort of despondent lows in the same movie that there must be something wrong with that. I don't think that's inherently true. I think it's depends on the story being told, and I think it depends on whether the movie can do both of those things well. I think that I didn't find this movie to be as funny as Dana did, but the fact that she found it that funny and was also that troubled by the ending suggests to me that it does the emotional highs, the emotional lows very well. On the, you know, we've all seen the movie, whether it's dystopian or not, where sort of the last person you would imagine having the wherewithal to triumph where no one else has triumphs. And that's a perfectly, you know, fine movie to make. This isn't that movie. And knowing what we know, mostly from Paul for these purposes, about Gilliam, but also, you know, what the rest of the first, you know, 90% of the movie suggests about his view of the world, it would seem, you know, shockingly, in a way, disingenuous for him to believe that was possible, or for that to be possible in that world. So I don't consider that I don't consider the wild differences in tone inherently a problem. It's a problem if they're not done equally well. And, you know, I think, you know, some of you have heard me say before, one of my problems with La La Land is that it wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to have the happy ending of the romance, but also the unhappy ending that shows that, you know, it's a thoughtful, serious movie about how the world really is. And I think they were making a musical and they wanted all of the benefits and opportunities of a traditional musical without ever having to run the risk or pay the price of being consistent to that tradition. And I hold that against that movie. I don't do that here because this movie is bleak. And so it may be laughably bleak or hysterically bleak. I mean, we've all probably found something funny at a funeral at some point in our lives. It doesn't mean the funeral isn't a very sad occasion. And so, you know, I don't think that's what's happening here. If the movie had ended with that fantasy, that would have been, to me, the disingenuous approach to it.
I love your analogy to La La Land, because La La Land, in the ways you're describing, having its cake and eating it too, I think you're right. It's a quintessentially American film, right? I mean, that's what American films, at least mainstream Hollywood American films, are hardwired to do, to have your cake and eat it too, to find a resolution of sorts that will make everyone confident enough in people's ability to shape their own lives. In this way, I think Terry Gilliam's Brazil is decidedly a European movie. It has a much more cynical view of institutions and authority. And another way to put this is, I think this film, it wasn't shown obviously, but I think this film would have been warmly received and recognizable to audiences in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And at the same time be recognizable to American audiences or Western audiences living under capitalism. Because no matter what system you're under, you recognize the absurdities of bureaucracy. You recognize that sometimes humor, maybe this is back to Dana's point, humor is sometimes the only way you can make your way through all that, make your peace with it. And it's often a black humor, a dark humor that gets you through. That was a hallmark, frankly, of citizens in the Soviet Union, right? The jokes they told, the stories they wrote, the things they could get away with outside of state censorship were deeply bitter, dark kinds of jokes. And the idea there is that's all you can do is laugh in the face of the nightmare. And I think that's where this film gets its sensibility from and is very different from, say, a La La Land.
Stephen, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just want to comment on, the futurism of this, and my read on this is he's intentionally saying that it's not the future, that it's the way we are and the way we've been. For example, a typewriter that's then connected to something else that then gets into the digital. And you were talking about, the lens over the small screens. I think what he's saying is that this is, always been and always will be, and it's not a future. So, he's building it, making you think it's a future dystopia, but we're actually living in it right now. There's no real innovation, and claims to innovation are really just built on a very shaky foundation. So I was just wondering if anybody else thought anything along those lines. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think you're right. I think that there's a reason why the film opens and stating that it's sometime in the 20th century, that, that I think, he doesn't want to come out and say it's here and now, because to say it's here and now, people will say, well, that's not our world. So I'm going to view the messages of this movie at a distance. But by suggesting it's just around the corner, he is saying the seeds of this, at the very least, are here. And I think you make a great point to, Blade Runner, when it came out, was, 40 something years in the future. This movie isn't even putting that relatively short distance ahead of itself. There's 15 years left in the 20th century when this movie comes out. So it's saying it's right around the corner. Paul.
Oh, I was just going to add another film that was coming to mind. Or is there Paul who's asking a question?
No, I meant you, Paul.
Oh, you meant me.
Yes.
Another film came to mind when I think you, Andrew, were talking about how rooted in our present our visions of the future in films are, right? How we want to replicate what we experience and just imagine it, better, more efficient, which isn't the case in Brazil, right? Everything is less efficient. But the other movie I have in mind, I think I had talked a little about Blade Runner in the intro too. Blade Runner, Brazil, and then something like 2001. 2001's vision of our technology and our future is so contrary in spirit, right, to Blade Runner or Brazil in that way. I mean, there are things that are dark about the story of 2001. That's a whole other seminar right there, which I'm happy to do. But the message about our technology, right, is that things will get even more elegant and streamlined and kind of amazing. And I mention this only in the sense that we have all these competing visions of the future in our minds that have been taught to us by movies. And I think it really shapes the way we actually relate to the technology when it does show up, whether it echoes something we already have or not. Think of, for example, communicators out of Star Trek and the fact that our smartphones are basically that now. We were prepped for that by those narratives, by those kinds of stories. And so something like Brazil is part of that conversation between humanity and machine.
Yeah. Paul T., you have a question or comment?
Hey, yeah, thanks. Just going back to, you were kind of acknowledging my point, my thesis earlier in the chat about that. I don't think Brazil is a masterpiece. I think it's a good film, but it's kind of a slog to watch from beginning to end in one setting. It's really better to view in pieces, I think. The different set pieces are ingenious in isolation, but when you're sitting there watching the whole thing, it really lacks an overall narrative structure. Sam's daydreams, Drew, you asked a great question. What could you cut out of it that could improve it, or what's the excess fat? I would say, first of all, Sam's daydreams, the fantasies of him flying around and rescuing Jill, they're just really heavy-handed. They're clumsy. They're lacking any suspense or real interest. Nothing's actually happening in those scenes, and you know that from the outset. So you're just sitting there watching him fly around and do battle with the samurai or whatever, and it's kind of like, okay, can we get back to reality? Because that's the only place where something's actually happening. And I don't mean that the daydream itself isn't important in the story. It's important as a device, but the way that Gilliam crafted it, it's boring as hell. Like, you're just kind of sitting there like, okay, we get it. You know what I mean?
So Paul, am I right? You wouldn't necessarily want to lose it, but you think it could be a whole lot more concise.
It could be a lot more. It would be a lot more compelling if they came up with some way to depict his fantasy where you were interested in it, or where maybe there was like some suspense there. I feel like the whole film falls apart suspense-wise because there's nothing at stake, and every time they go back to it more and more, it's just kind of repetitive. And I understand at the end of the movie, he escapes into that fantasy. That's how he gets away from the dystopia, but it hurts the film just from a craft standpoint when you're watching it. And to me, one of the most clever scenes in the movie is when he's wrestling with the desk in his new little office, right? That little coffin of an office. That's brilliant. And you're sitting there watching it and you're just completely entertained. But then it goes back to like this dreary kind of flat fantasy about Jill. And just on top of that, just to piggyback on my own point, why is he so obsessed with Jill? Who is Jill? Like, she's just this like symbol. She's not really a person. She's not really a character. You know what I mean? She's not flesh and blood. So even his whole goal of trying to find her and join up with her, what's the interest? Just she's a terrorist and she resembles.
He's obsessed with her because she looks just like the woman he's been dreaming about.
Which is not a real person. You see what I'm saying?
I don't see what you're saying, because he's created a picture in his mind, right? He's created this, what he imagines to be some sort of hypothetical ideal. And then he actually sees that person.
Right.
I can easily understand becoming obsessed about the person who looks just like the person I thought I imagined.
But the way she's written, the way Jill is written, she's not a person. And you just pointed out why, because the whole point of her is just what she looks like. She resembles someone in his imagination, which makes her even less of a real person. And they don't do anything to change that. You got an almost 3-hour movie and that character's never developed.
I want to take issue a little bit with that, but I want to do it with a slightly different take on the dreams. And I can understand what you're saying as far as how the dreams are shot and cut or not cut and threaten the pace of the film. I think that's a real concern. But by the same token, I don't think Gilliam, as the director and the auteur, if you will, here, I don't think Gilliam is endorsing those dreams. I think this is a very important thing to think about. Gilliam is not saying that that's the answer, to just live in those fantasies. In fact, the problem with Sam's fantasies is they're medieval fantasies of heroism that have no place whatsoever in the struggle at hand, and that are actually deflecting Sam from recognizing the urgent humanity of his situation and those of people like Buttle. And it's finding his humanity and getting out of those fantasies ultimately, or at least the knightly heroic fantasies of saving the damsel, and actually getting to know Jill more as a human being, just a little bit, relative to the mere image that she is in those dreams. I think that's where he starts to discover a kind of moral compass and has a sense of the stakes here that are bigger than just his own survival or even that of Jill's. So I'm not saying she's as well drawn a character as I would like. I think I take your point there. But by the end of the film, the fantasy he does retreat to is not so much any longer the knight saving the world situation. It's a fantasy of domesticity. It's a fantasy of the countryside. It's a fantasy of a life where you're not constantly asked for your name, rank, and serial number and social security number and all the rest. And so I think there's actually a kind of evolution in Sam's fantasizing, if you will. I don't know if it's comforting at all, because from my point of view, he's still just as much a tortured prisoner of the state who's been lobotomized. But in his head, right, there is a different outcome, a different possibility for him that's predicated on knowing another human being more intimately than just the way you do in a dream like this. So I think that the film is actually kind of tormented by those dreams. And maybe Gilliam is too, right? Because there's a part of Gilliam, as I said earlier, that saw himself as the rabble rouser who would do the dramatic thing that saves the world, right? This is when he says, I might have blown some buildings up. But I think part of this film is recognizing that that's all a load of nonsense, that there's no magic action you can take and become the hero. That's the scary truth of it all, right? That a hero's not going to solve this.
Yeah, great points. Thanks for addressing those. Great observations, Paul and Drew. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. No, and I'm with you on the pacing of those things doesn't help the movie.
Well, on top of your point, then, if I could just pose a question to examine maybe about that, then, is the terrorist movement even real?
I don't think so by this point. We're told it's been around 13 years, and there seems to be evidence as the film goes on that the government is actually committing the violence. Now, it doesn't mean the government doesn't have enemies. Clearly they do. Part of thing going on, and told his own way is a rebel, but kind of a rebel on his own terms, right? A rebel with his own cause, which is namely to fix your HVAC problems.
But remember the death of Tuttle? How about the death of Tuttle? The way he gets wrapped up like a mummy in scrap paper.
In paper, yeah.
When Sam pulls the paper apart, there's no one there. He's vanished. Like, does that mean he never existed?
Murdered by paperwork.
Like, it's like Sam's reality has been Sam's fantasies have been bleeding into reality, and we didn't quite know that maybe until really the end of the story. Maybe.
I don't know. But at any rate, the knight in shining armor isn't going to help, right? That's the hard lesson Sam has to learn.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for both Pauls, but Paul T, thanks very much for the really interesting perspectives. There's one other thing, as I said in the beginning, I found this movie, I didn't use the word slog, but I found this movie to be a bit of a slog as well. I thought that was by design. I find Schindler's List to be a slog too. And I know that's by design. But I think the dreams serve one other important purpose, a purpose that I will grant could have been conveyed with shorter segments, dream segments, which is try to imagine this movie, toward the end of this movie, when Jonathan Pryce actually picks up a stick and starts fighting. If that character had done that, absent any of the dream sequences, we would have said, where has this meek pencil pusher, afraid of promotion, gotten the wherewithal to do this? And we have no trouble believing he'll do that because he's been dreaming about doing it through the whole movie. That doesn't mean those sequences couldn't have been shorter, but they do serve, I think, an important narrative purpose. Vera, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. I've been taking these classes from the very beginning, but I don't normally feel like speaking up for some reason, but I feel like I have to say it because of Paul. So, Paul, you mentioned something about this movie being funny to both Soviet Union kind of people, and at the same time Americans looking for, a happy resolution. And I just feel like I wanted to comment on it because I grew up in the Soviet Union, right? And then I totally agree with you. So I just wanted to validate what you said. Like it's funny how normally people, movies are one way or another. And this movie actually accommodate both kind of sense of humor. And I first watched a movie when I was a teenager. So I was about 16, 17, right over USSR. I don't even know how I get a hold of this movie. I found it hilarious. And it's the second time I watched it now. And it's just still as funny to me and as good. And it's interesting how the humor works both ways, right? Like for people who grew up in communistic environment and for people who grew up in United States. So I really just wanted to compliment what you said, because I think I can validate that from my background. And another thing what Dana said about the movie being funny, and Andrew, what you said about the scene, about when she said, what did you do with the body, right? So you said it's a very sad scene, which kind of contradicts the comical thing. But I actually found that this movie actually can do both, which is really amazing. So at some certain very sad scene, you can find a comical element, which is really ridiculous. It's kind of mind-blowing. So when this woman screams, what did you do with the body? When you look at her facial expression, you find some comical effect, which is really sick. But you kind of feel both. You feel sad, eternal sadness for her, but you feel also a ridicule of it. So it's kind of I don't know how he does it, but to me, the movie did both at the same time, which I find amazing. So again, working for both kind of audiences, and being sad and funny at the same time. But I really wanted to compliment Paul kind of commentary on it, because I just can validate it from my perspective. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Vera. And of course, it matters a whole lot more coming from you.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You said that nobody really kind of commented. I was like, yes, he's on the money. I have to say it.
And a lot of my friends are from Eastern Europe, and my wife grew up in Albania under Hoxha and that regime. So, understanding you have to fix it, change it. I think that's really an important part of this film's outlook on the world. And I agree with you that it's a movie that can reach a lot of different audiences and even play into their ideological leanings. I think I mentioned in the intro, at least one interview, Gilliam talks about people on the right as well as the left gravitating to this film and thinking that the kind of revolt against the system that doesn't work in the movie but somehow still has to happen, that's the way to go. And I don't know how many people on January 6th in that crowd were ever watching Brazil or even knew of its existence, but there is a kind of anti-authoritarian spirit that crosses party lines and ideological lines. And I don't know to what degree this movie reflects on that enough, in the sense of saying, be careful what you wish for, right? I mean, you don't like the government you have and you want to do something about it, but does that justify anything and everything in the name of it?
But I think I found a very thin irony in it, because we're talking about how small the audiences are, which might enjoy it, but at the same time, you see the world coverage is very large, right? So I don't know, it's really been my favorite movie, and I was surprised, it still am.
I would love to know the story of how you found it. I mean, somehow or other you got your hands on it, or you were able to see it.
Exactly. No, it's actually, it's escaped me. I was wondering myself, it was not really available, but I think it was one of those friend passed to a friend, and it's semi-forbidden, and then friend passed to a friend, and then, yeah, that's how it happened.
If you want something that's really funny and dark and gets at this kind of what it's like to live under totalitarianism,
well, I lived under totalitarianism.
There's something called, I know, and there's something called Comrade Detective I recommend to you. Most people haven't seen it. It's hilarious.
I haven't, but I will. Thank you, Paul.
Check it out.
I just really compliment your comments. It's just, you're absolutely down to money on it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vera, for sharing your perspective and your experiences that really added something to this conversation. So thank you very much for speaking up about those. Janis, you have a question or comment?
Yes.
Go ahead.
There is one particular scene that when it was on, I went, oh my goodness, I've just seen the scene. And of course, it was something much later. The scene where the scientist, whatever he was where there was the fly in the room and he was climbing on everything and doing everything he could to get the fly. Well, I had just binge watched Breaking Bad. And there is this whole thing with a fly in the meth lab. And I looked at it, I said, I think he saw this movie before he did the scene. It was just so familiar. And I kind of wondered whether that scene in this movie was a takeoff on something else from the past that I am not aware of. But these two scenes were like watching the same thing, just in a different setting, one in the meth lab and one here.
That Breaking Bad episode, which I think is titled Fly, is very divisive among fans. There are people who love it and people who hate it. But it definitely gets at this kind of absurdity and Kafkaesque vibe that we see certainly in Brazil, but also was a part of Breaking Bad. There's even an episode of Breaking Bad called Kafkaesque. So I think you're on to something there.
Okay, but did that refer to some in this movie? Did it refer to something that came even before 1985?
I'm not sure. I mean, it well could have. If you're thinking of Kafka and Metamorphosis, that's a different kind of story, right? That's someone turning into a bug.
Yes.
It's entirely possible, Janis. We don't know, but someday maybe one of us will see some movie from the 50s or 60s, and we'll say, "Aha!" That's one of the great things about going back and watching older movies. Thanks for your comments, Janis.
Okay.
Ron, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, just thank you so much for doing this. When I first got the email, I thought, oh my God, somebody's doing something on Brazil. Like this is just, it's just this wonderful film that nobody knows about. So thank you for doing this. I find Terry Gilliam just to be, he's sort of that court jester that just, he brings joy and absurdity about everything, but it's also sad and just, shows his frustrated side. I love his films and I always see him on the big screen because there's just no other films like his, and they're just so unique, and like it's like going to the circus or something, like I just don't know what to expect, and I just love that, because so much of what comes out of Hollywood, you already know what the film's going to be about, and with Terry Gilliam, he's sort of like the Frank Zappa of film. Like it's just like you don't know where he's going to go. So I just love him so much. I love Katherine Hellman. When I heard that she was going to be in the film, I was just, oh my God, I just love her so much. And if I ever meet De Niro, this is the one film I'm going to ask him about. Like, what was it like, And it's just such a British film. And it is long, but I mean, it's like, it's a Terry Gilliam film. It's like, you don't want that to be short and sweet, like you want it to, be a little lemon curd with, a chunk of garlic in the middle of it, and it's just so horrible that like a film is only worthy if it makes a lot of money in the box office, which is just the opposite of what Terry Gilliam is. And just a super quick story. I got to meet Terry Gilliam when he was making 12 Monkeys. I had no idea what was happening. I just happened to be in Center City near the Wanamaker's building, and there was a group of people standing around, and and I could tell it was a film. And I asked a woman next to me, I said, what's going on? They said, oh, it's a big film. And I said, is there anybody famous? And she said, oh yeah, Brad Pitt's here, Bruce Willis is here. And I said, oh, have you seen him? And yeah, we just saw him a couple minutes ago. So I stood around. I had no idea what the film was. Nobody knew what the film was. And Terry Gilliam walks by me, and I'm like, oh my God, Terry Gilliam. And he just kind of looks at me and nods, but he's busy, right? And the lady next to me, she goes, Terry Gilliam? Terry Gilliam? Who the hell is Terry Gilliam? And Terry turns to me and just laughs and says, one guy knows who I am, you know? And he thanked me and we talked a little bit, but it was a cool moment. And I feel like in 12 Monkeys, like every time I see scenes, I'm like, oh my God, I was there.
I love, Ron, that you didn't care about Brad Pitt being in the vicinity. It was Terry Gilliam.
Yeah, right.
And I'm also glad that that the call to the fans of Brazil was heard, right? I mean, some of the people coming to this had not seen it before or had not really thought about it before. And I knew other folks would come to it as you do with a love of the movie and of Gilliam's work. I often think of his movies, and some are more successful than others, obviously, from a creative standpoint. I often think of them as fables for postmodernity. They're fables we need to contend with the realities of how we're living. And to your question or your point about De Niro, he was originally interested in the part played by Michael Palin, the torturer. But Gilliam had promised Palin that part, and those guys obviously go way back to Monty Python. But De Niro still wanted to be involved, and that's kind of where the character of Tuttle came in, which is not a large part, but it's a really important one in the movie, and I like what De Niro does with it.
Thanks, Ron. Ken, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just one comment, a couple of quick questions. We talk about the references to Mad Magazine, and I agree with them, some of those contraptions. But I remember years ago in Mad, they had a big cartoon of some construction workers laying out a blueprint at the site of where a building was being built, and someone swatted a fly on the blueprint. And they showed the final building, and there was a big sculpture of a fly along the side of the building that was built up. It reminded me very much of this. I think they must have drawn on that.
Nice.
And the two questions I had, one, and I know you mentioned this in the intro, Paul, is where the name came from. I may have missed that. And the second one was how, which we've covered a little, is how big a star was Robert De Niro at this point that he was willing to take a role like this? Usually, you'd see him a little more prominently.
He was certainly big enough at that point to said, I'm not going to be involved in this movie, and if I am, I need to have a big role. He was clearly happy to play a very small part in this. The title comes from really the song, that jaunty, upbeat song of Brazil. And obviously the movie's not specifically about Brazil, but it's about the contrast, right, between the world of this film and the joy of that music. And so the counterpoint, the use of counterpoint in the music in this film is very, very powerful, I think.
Okay, I didn't realize till I watched that it took me a minute to realize this has nothing to do with taking place in Brazil.
That's right. Although it could be there, it doesn't have to be there.
I guess it could have been, but I need a lot more imagination for that. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, De Niro was a really big star at this point. This is after Godfather 2, after Taxi Driver, after Deer Hunter, after Raging Bull. So yeah, but he was never, I mean, to this point, I mean, he wasn't making the sort of commercial movies he would go on to make. He didn't have the same commercial interests, it didn't appear, at this point in his career that he did then.
He's not meeting any parents yet.
Right. He wasn't meeting any parents. He wasn't analyzing this or that. Yeah. Right. But he wasn't an intern. But he would have been recognized the world over as a major name. And as Paul said, would have, the type of person you would find a thing for in your movie if you had any sense at all. Let's see. Lee, did you have another question or comment? No, okay. Well, then I guess we're done for the evening. Thank you so much, everybody, for your wonderful comments, those in support of the film and those in challenge of it. It makes for a wonderful discussion, I think. We have a number of our Tuesday night seminars coming up. You can see them on the screen there, a host of topics, including one taught by Paul on Martin Scorsese and his movies coming up next month. You can check those out, more information about those, full descriptions, and register in the Film Studies Online section at brynmarfilm.org. In addition, we have a lot of other opportunities to learn about and engage with film there. We have the Ask Andrew mini lessons, a library of those. We have all of our past discussions and all of the past instructor introductions to the more than 50 movies we have done these discussions for, and a lot of great film-themed original puzzles and crosswords and things like that. So check those out. We are open for business at the theater, showing movies, every weekend and on Wednesdays as well. But if you're not ready to come out to the theater, there's still Theater 5, where we are screening new movies that you can only get through your local theater. And some of them are Oscar-nominated films. Some of them are other movies that would have come out in our theater this year or last year if we had been open. And we're happy to bring them to you any way we can. So check out Theater 5. Part of our online endeavors for, going on 13 months now. And we appreciate your interest in us and your support of us, however that may take shape. Whether you come to the theater and buy a ticket, whether you join and become a member, whether you pay to take a seminar or to watch one of our films at home, or if you'd like to make a donation, we would certainly appreciate that as well. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And please remember, if you want to find out what movie we're discussing every week, sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send out the education email with identifying the movie that's going to be discussed on Monday, a link to the introduction, and a link for you to sign up to participate in this Zoom discussion. So there's a lot going on at brynmarfilm.org. Please check it out. And until next time, thanks so much for joining us. Paul, thank you very much for helping us have such a wonderful, insightful discussion. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everybody.